Hello and welcome. This is Guy Glidden, and this is the second in a set of 4 screen videos to help you get a handle on measurement and research concepts. So these would be good things to get under your belt early on as you begin to read examples of research presentations and we start to talk about concepts or you hear about things. This will give you a kind of a vocabulary base. This screen also presents a view of the others in this set. So this is research concepts. You'll also be able to look at measurement concepts, and you probably want to look at that first, then research concepts second, and then memory jogger tools third, and then there's going to be an Excel file that's going to help you with some really good examples and illustrations of both measurement and research concepts. Now, it's available to you at any time, but you probably want to get a handle on your Excel skills before you use that. It'll help you a great deal in doing that. So that kind of depends. Your timing on the Excel file is going to depend on how proficient you view yourself as being with Excel skills. Anyway, this gives you an idea of what we have to start with the process, and let's move on. Let's do a beginning process to compare some things about some ideas, and I want to compare the concept of what we call anecdotal incidents or research methodology. Anecdotal incidents are simply descriptors by one or a set of people about something that's happened to them that could have to do with success in teaching something in science. It could have to do with something that has nothing to do with research. The news broadcasts are constantly filled with anecdotal incidents. And we hear a story about somebody and we hear one example, and it's kind of implied by the news provider that we should maybe generalize that information. But if it's an anecdotal incident, it means there's no method or consistency of addressing questions. We don't have any comparison of the kind of situation with other situations we're looking at, so there's no way for us to have a multiplying effect. If we're looking at a whole bunch of anecdotal incidents, the number of cases makes no difference. In other words, if I assign you the task of going out and interviewing a group of people about how do you like this class, if you go out and interview 30 people in the class and you ask them all different questions, those are 30 different anecdotal incidents. They don't have any research effect. On the other hand, and this is where I'm getting to research methodology, if you create a design and a method, you can have a research effect. And carrying my little stupid example a little bit further, if you were to do a survey on this class, if we sat down before you started and we created a method, we created a good effective survey tool, created a way that we were going to get data back and a way that we were going to collect the data, then we would have the beginning of research methodology. And when you do that, concepts which we talked about in the measurement concepts, reliability and validity apply. In other words, we have a way to get a handle on those things. That's a part of the methodology. We have the concept of research proof, which is kind of the idea of looking at the reduction of probability that absurd conditions that are caused by chance or accident. And that's always one of the things we want to avoid in research. So look at the whole concept on climate change we're faced with in the media right now. Are the climate factors we're looking at simply incidental accidents that are happening and we're looking at a whole bunch of years in a row, or 100 years or so in a row of, or are we talking about systematic climate change? Well, I'm not going to get any further on that example, but so you're seeing we're looking at research methodology gives us a better opportunity, or at least a possibility of understanding what goes on. In research methodology, obviously, that means we want to look at the ways to reduce the variability by looking at the number of cases and the development of the design that reduces errors and inconsistencies. Now, if we do that, we have a chance of generalizing. In other words, taking something you found in your research in Dodge City or Garden City or a Wichita school and saying, would that apply to other schools? Well, we don't know yet, but if we have used good research methodology, that's certainly a possibility. Here are some ways of looking at, and we're going to use interchangeably the idea of a research question, a research statement, or research hypothesis. The end result is at the end, bottom line, it doesn't matter whether you do it in the form of a question, a statement, or a research hypothesis. And you've got 3 concrete examples using the concept of study island, which is a system of improving achievement that many of you in some school districts know about. But the whole idea is the question, whether it's a statement, a question, or hypothesis, it has to be something that's supported by very precise clarifications and definitions. And that's really the theme song of this whole process here. Research is all about details, and so having precise control. So when we say methodology, we want to have everything in the research process under control. That's what we mean by good research methodology. So a little bit about when we use the idea of a research question, a statement, or hypothesis. Don't make a big difference out of it. They can be used interchangeably sometimes depending on how you phrase it. We want to look at some different types of research studies that we're going to be looking at, and here are 3 good examples to look at here. The most common thing that we hear about in research, and you'll be reading lots of studies about, is where we look at alternative forms of treatment within the same time period. So go back to our example of study island. Suppose we had 2 groups of students in the Dodge City schools, and one was receiving treatment in schools. They were using study island, and some were using another form of strategy to improve performance. So that there we would have 2 different strategies that we could compare. Both are for the same purpose. We want people to do better in some subject matter. We want them to achieve better. So that would be something where we would look at the idea of alternative forms of treatment within the same time period. We could do an across-the-board comparison. Another possibility that we're facing with a great deal, which is important to our school, as we're looking at comparisons, are the possibility of program improvement over a sequence of time periods. So usually when you're looking at school accreditation, you're looking at the mandate of how are you demonstrating your school's continuing to improve. So that means you have to look at performance 2 years ago and performance a year ago and performance this year and say, is there evidence that we're improving? Well, that's a different kind of issues, because the kids who were in 3rd grade 2 years ago aren't sticking around to be compared with themselves a year ago or this year. So you have 3 different groups of kids in your 3rd grade each year, or your 5th grade or your 10th grade or whatever you're doing here. So over a time period, you have some other questions that you need to ask in terms of that process. But that's a second area that we'll look at a lot, and that has a lot to do with the concept of program improvement. More about that later. And finally, I want to introduce this concept. We're going to see some studies that are really based on the idea of looking at the development of a base of demographic information. So if the 2 studies that I introduced, if you have read the help section or followed the screencast on the help section that I provided to help you get a start on looking at research articles, I used 2 research studies that I had completed. Both of them are of the 3rd type, developing a new base of information. So, and one had to do with teen employment information, the other had to do with the idea of getting information about the availability of computers for student use in schools. So here are 3 different types of studies that, and not one's not better than the other, they're just different types or different things. We talk a lot about variables in research designs. And so this is just a really nice long-winded way of saying attention to the details and describing what you're doing in research is really critical. You need to look at every possible factor. Time period of research, people involved in the research, specific requirements of when we set up a research project, that we want to make sure that if we are committed that certain things are going to be available to students, we got to make sure that they are, so that we know we're investigating that. So I'll give you a stupid illustration you can probably see the difference of. Suppose that we decided that we were going to do a study on the use of iPads in our school, and iPads are very popular, so some of you may even want to do that. Good idea. But suppose that in setting up the research methodology, you neglected to pay attention to the access of every single student in your group to an iPad. So does that make a difference? Does it make a difference if students are using their own iPads or whether they're using school-provided iPads? And how about the availability of apps on those iPads? See, all of those are specific issues that get into variables. So the bottom line here is the devil's in the details, and you have to pay a lot of attention to the details in research studies. A lot has been made about the difference between the concepts of quantitative and qualitative research. And I want to address that right now because I have a strong bias, and I'll be clear about it in the idea. When I talk about the concept of quantitative research, I'm talking about research where the variables are already identified as in numeric terms, numeric values. So test scores already have numbers applied to them. Weight gain for infants, big issue if you have a young child in the house. So already we have when we think of weight gain, we already think of ounces or pounds or some other kind of a weight measure kind. Speed, already when we introduce the idea of speed, somebody doing something faster than another, a race or a concept that we think time is important in, we already think in terms of measuring. So when we get the initial element we want to look at, the variable in this quantitative research is already addressed in terms of something that has a numeric value. Qualitative is a little different in this sense. Qualitative is frequently used of things like looking at measuring of quality, of writing, musical performance, freestyle ice skating are 3 examples I can come up with. In those cases, we don't normally think of those outcomes in terms of numeric values, but it simply means to make a research study out of it, you simply have to go ahead and you have to convert those qualitative aspects into quantitative by using a rubric or a scoring guide or a rating guide and creating a numeric coefficient for different levels of music performance, writing quality, or freescale ice skating. In the end, when we've done the conversion, the measurement process is the same. I want to talk just briefly about ethical considerations. 2 aspects are important. One is making sure whenever we do a research study, we're taking steps to protect participants in the research studies. That's critical in all cases, as it would be in any endeavor of education. Enough said. The other thing is that in research, you have to make sure that, pardon me, you are setting up a process whereby you are creating a firewall between your bias as a person and the research process. This is critical in research because if you aren't able to demonstrate that there's a firewall between a personal bias and the research process, you don't have any credibility for your research, so you're wasting your time. So those are 2 critical aspects. And finally, the last thing I want to mention very briefly is the role of theory and generation in research. If we do a good job of applying research methodology, then we have a good chance of taking what we're done and saying, okay, now, if we have all of these variables understood, we really clearly describe the population, the nature of the school, the program that's being used in that school when we're doing an educational research, we could generalize this to other schools that might have similar groups of students or might be doing instruction on the same strategies, and they might be able to gain from us. Again, if you've designed your methodology well, you can do that. If it's not well designed, then you're back in slide 1 where we talked to the idea of incidents that don't have research methodology. So this should give you a little bit of beginning on some research terms, and we'll go on with the next video of talking about the idea of some tools to help you in the process.